Hello everyone and welcome to this episode, the Organisational Cultures One of the Women Talking About Learning podcast. I'm Andrew Jacobs. Culture is one of those things we talk about a lot in organisations, often as though everyone means the same thing by it. But culture affects how people communicate, how they work together, what gets noticed, what gets rewarded, and sometimes what gets in the way. So for this episode, we've got three guests coming at it from slightly different perspectives. Our first guest is Pinar Goodwin. Kelly is the founder and lead intercultural trainer at Culture Savvy, where she works with leaders and teams on working effectively across cultures. She does bring a research-based approach alongside more than a decade of experience working with clients across more than 40 countries. Our next guest is Tamsin Sainsbury-Hyde. Tamsin is a people and culture leader who has worked across consultancy and in-house roles with a particular interest in leadership, learning and organisational development. She's interested in what actually drives organisational behaviour and performance, what sits beneath the surface, and how asking better questions can help organisations make sense of some pretty complex challenges. And our final guest is Rebecca Edwards. Rebecca works in learning, talent and OD, helping organisations strengthen leadership capability, develop talent and create the conditions for people to learn and perform. She has a particular interest in organisational culture, high-performing teams and the relationship between employee experience, leadership, learning and purpose. We recorded this conversation in July 2026 and, as is often the case with these episodes, it went in a few directions I wasn't expecting. This is Women Talking About Learning. This is Kelly, Tamsin and Rebecca talking about organisational culture.
So, Kelly, why did you choose this particular episode to be a guest on?
So my work primarily has to do with helping leaders and teams from different cultural backgrounds communicate effectively together. Communicate, collaborate, lead, make decisions across cultural differences. And I've been in that space for over 15 years now. And over time, I kind of began to realize, all right, so obviously we're talking about national differences, but there are also differences even from organization to organization, from company to company, or sometimes within the same organization that's in multiple countries. You see different local cultures or different teams within the same country or different departments have different cultures. And so key point for me was reading Daniel Coyle's book, The Culture Code. Really began thinking more in this space. And so, yeah, I guess I would say in the last few years, this has become an area of interest for me, of understanding how, but more than just national cultures, how organizations create culture, both as a homogenous culture, but also how they have diversity and how they navigate change in cultures. So, yeah, I guess I would say that's my entrance into this topic. Tamsin, how about you?
I think for me, the reason I wanted to talk about culture is kind of the flip, really. I work in-house. So a big part of the role that I play in the organization is very much around thinking about how actually culture is having the impact that perhaps we don't necessarily see on some of the decisions we're making, the direction of travel we're wanting to go in, and some of those things that often kind of get billed as like, oh, there's a problem here or there's a challenge here, when actually often it's about the culture. So what are the things about the culture that we're not really understanding and seeing? And so, yeah, I'm fascinated by it really, because I think we don't talk about it enough. I think so much of organizational kind of change, organizational challenges or opportunities are banded as, oh, we just need to do this process differently or this differently. And actually it's like, let's take a minute and look what's under the surface of what's maybe driving some of this. So yeah, fascinated to hear from both of you around kind of your perspectives as well. Rebecca, how about you?
Yeah, really interesting to hear both of you sort of go through that. I think for me, I am someone who really believes that everyone should feel amazing at work and should be able to do their best in wherever they are. And obviously culture plays a massive, massive part in that. So for me, it's always just been a bit of an interest, probably more personally, that has definitely spanned into the work that I've done. I think similar to Tamsin, I've always been in-house learning, development, talent teams. And similarly to what you've said, you know, we are the teams that are often really heavily relied on when there's quite a big change coming and you're trying to input something. Actually, sometimes, you know, the learning is really heavily impacted by the culture that is already in place in a business. So yeah, it's probably similar. I'm quite fascinated by that. And also, you know, that fascination in terms of the same business having different cultures, a bit like what you said, Kelly, the same business having different cultures in different offices or even in the same office, but in different teams that maybe don't work together so closely. So yeah, super, super interesting. I wonder, Kelly, if you could maybe expand more on that and sort of give us a bit more of an understanding of the teams that you've worked with and what you've seen.
I've noticed quite a diverse experience for different people, everywhere from working with an expat moving from headquarters to C-suite role in another office in another country and saying, I'm not sure I work at the same company. Like, if I didn't know the name was the same above the door, I would think I'm in a totally different place in a different organization. To people who cross countries in the same company and say, oh, it's completely the same. And sometimes when you dig a little deeper, you actually find, well, they're mostly the same, but there are those nuances of how do you give feedback actually in this location? And how do you make decisions as a leader and get the buy-in of the people around you? Even I was working with some middle managers. I live in Turkey. And so I was working with some middle managers in the Turkish office of a Swedish global corporation. And these Turkish middle managers were telling me this problem they have. They say, you know, headquarters is telling us that when we give feedback to our direct reports, we need to give it directly and clearly. So if a direct report says, hey, I actually want to move to this position and we feel like that's not appropriate, we need to directly come out and say, nope, sorry, that role is not suited for you. And the Turkish managers were saying, if we told that to our direct reports, they would be devastated. They would be so offended, right? We might actually end up losing those people. And so helping them manage, you know, what do you do when headquarters says one thing, but in the local culture, that's actually a really offensive way to communicate. So I think those are some of the differences, as well as, you know, just different departments having different values and ways of doing things, you know, accounting or legal being very much by the book, no exceptions. This is the way it is, top down. And then you have other departments who are much more, you know, equal sharing of decision making and a lot more inclusive and a lot more taking decisions on a case by case basis. So then what happens when these departments are trying to work together? Yeah, so I think those are kind of a variety of different ways that I've seen these things happen. I'm curious to hear if any of this resonates with what either of you have seen or experienced.
I think that last point is the fascinating one around the differences of cultures across an organization, and how it's a conversation actually that has come up quite a few times when we're kind of trying to think about organizational culture and, you know, what are the things that need to change in order for us to pivot or go after the things that we need to go after. And, you know, we're talking about this kind of top level, this is the organizational culture that we need, and everybody needs to get behind it. And then you get kind of questions from teams around, but what about our own culture? You know, that's really important for us. You know, it's something we're trying to cultivate. We're trying to kind of think about what do we need as a team or a directorate or a function to be able to, you know, do the things that we need to do and do it well. And I think it's just such an interesting, like, how do you layer those together? Because actually in that respect, you're right. I think actually a finance team would be different to an operational team, that will be different to a kind of income generating team, because it has to be, right? The things that they're working on every day, you know, you're going to be a bit more maybe kind of gung-ho or going after things in the income generation than in the finance. You're probably going to be a bit more like risk adverse because you need to be,
Mhm.
you know, you're managing the organizational finances. So yeah, it's a conversation that keeps kind of coming around, and I've been trying to make sense of that to to try and say, well, actually, yes, we have, we do need an organizational culture and the things we will accept and won't, but actually how that comes to life actually has to come out in the work that you do. So there will be those nuances in it. But yeah, it's interesting. Is it the same, Rebecca, for you?
Yeah, definitely. I've worked in a couple of global businesses where we've had offices, in lots of different locations, and I think it's really important to. I mean, you've sort of both said this anyway, but so I do feel like I'm repeating this a little bit, but I think it's important to have those nuances in different teams and in different offices, because I think going back to what I said earlier, for me, a great culture is people being able to do their best at work. And if that means creating an environment that is slightly different for them compared to, another office, another location, another team, I do think that is important. But I think the point that you raised, Kelly, that I've definitely found in my own experience is that difference in communication and the way we communicate, and actually feedback being a really good one. And, whether that feedback can be super direct and just saying, actually, no, that's wrong, and we just don't do it like that, to, maybe trying to add a little bit of, I'm going to use the word fluff, but, it's not the right word, but
Softening, maybe.
Yeah, softening it, absolutely. And I was reading something earlier actually about sort of like the British way versus, maybe a different culture, and how we feel like we just need to be a little bit more nice sometimes in the UK, or maybe in some more westernized cultures. And actually that's not always the way that we can work or we can do things, but it's important for us to have those differences if we need to, from a national culture or a country culture point of view.
From a personal perspective, I'm about to move actually to Australia, and I'd be really interested. So I grew up there, but there's a difference in, like work life. I've lived my whole working life in the UK. It would be fascinating to see actually how does that, like, what are those differences and those things that actually is feedback more straightforward over there, or is it similar to the UK? So after I'll let you know. We can come back in a year's time and see what that looks like. Rebecca, I'd be interested in your perspective around, I like about the kind of the sentiment that people should feel good at work, right? And they should be able to do their best work. How do you navigate that, or how do you kind of see that playing out in kind of today's society, where I think there's often a kind of a shift to actually it should be tailored to me, so that, everything should be tailored to me. But then actually you're working in an organization where there are things and customs and culture and processes that have to be done a certain way. How do you find kind of navigating that?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think it's a great question because, I think particularly when you work in the spaces that we work in terms of the roles that we do and the teams that we're on, we're probably always looking for an element of, how do I make sure this is personalised enough for each individual and it's right for each individual. I think you can only do that to a certain point, particularly when you're talking about an overarching company culture. That culture stems from things like the company values, as an example, almost as a bit of a foundation. And then it's the individuals and their behaviours and the actions that they take that then build on that. So I think for me, that personalisation comes down to, individual leaders and individual teams being able to get what's right for the people that they work with directly, but ensuring that, the things that they are doing it feels very like dictatorial, what I'm about to say, but almost fall in line with the company values to a certain extent, because that's the business they're working for. I was having a think about this earlier actually, in terms of not so much about the personalisation for each individuals, but I guess what does culture look like across different businesses and different organisations, and does the type of industry that you're in, does that impact the culture that you have in a workplace, as well as like the country that you work in, as an example. I don't know whether, but either of you have worked across different industries and have seen differences.
Do you want to go first, Kelly?
I'll take a second if you have something to say.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, and it's only my experience, right? There's only so much you can kind of base on that. But definitely, so I came from the private sector before moving into the charity sector. And it's fundamentally different cultures. And it was quite a shock, really, when I first kind of joined the charity sector. I also have worked in the higher education. So again, kind of such different cultures around really interesting things. So like speed, pace of work, one of those, decision making, definitely, in private sector, very much it was around essentially what the CEO says is, the bottom line. Whereas within the other two spaces, it's much more collaborative. There's much more of kind of an openness to listening and hearing different perspectives. And then as well, just around the kind of the financial side of things, because actually you're thinking about finances in a different way when you come from a private sector where it's all around kind of, making that money, than when you go into the third sector or the public sector where there just isn't that same drive. But actually, how do you still give people the same, I guess, skills to understand how they have to think about finances in that separate space? So yeah, it has been really fascinating. And one of the things that we've been doing as a team recently has been building a leadership program for our senior leaders. And where I came from was a consultancy that did that. And just the difference even in understanding, well, what you might put in a training program or a leadership program for, a big organization is so different when you then think about, well, actually, what's the culture that this organization has, and what's the shift we're trying to make as well? Because I think often we do these, we need to do this thing because we need to change this, but actually, are we thinking about what's the culture change we're trying to initiate, as opposed to just, well, we need everyone to be better at financial management? That's not one of the things, but for example, that we've been talking about. So yeah, from my experience, I felt like it has been quite different depending on the sector that I've been in.
Yeah, I think it took me a moment to think about that question. And as I was thinking, I realized that part of it is because I feel like I still transition back and forth very regularly. And I think part of that might be because as a solopreneur, I kind of have the entrepreneur, solopreneur community or realm maybe, and on the other hand my clients are all global corporations, and so that's kind of a whole nother way of operating and interacting. And then I also had a stint in working at a university doing anthropological research, and the first example that came to mind for me actually was that transition from working at a university or higher ed space into corporate space. For example, in presentations. So in higher ed, I found presentations, they're often read word for word, verbatim from a paper. So someone's standing up there and just reading for pages and pages. And then you go into the corporate space where I'm a keynote speaker or I'm going to conferences and hearing others. And, there's no way you would see anything like that, right? Completely different values for what's important in a presentation. So yeah, that was kind of an example that came to mind. And Rebecca, actually, I want to come back to when you were talking about suited to me versus more broad conformity. It made me think about something I often talk about in culture adaptation is we have what we call cultural values, and these are on schemas. So we have direct communication and indirect communication, hierarchy, more low hierarchy, leadership styles. So we have 10 or 12 of these different dimensions. And what I often talk about when I'm working with a team is that, to some degree, we usually all have to flex. So even if you're looking at a country of people, usually we'll say, oh, well, Egyptians are this way and Indians are this way. But even within that, we're all individuals. Usually no one lines up 100% with their national cultural values. And in the same way, I think it's true of an organization of, on the one hand, we all need to conform and be part of the whole. But on the other hand, we're all individuals with different needs and different gifts and perspectives to bring. But I think an important thing here is also some self-realization of if you're adapting on everything always, maybe that's not the best fit, right? Like we all need to adapt, but if you find that on all these different cultural values, you're the one who has to adjust, maybe you should be looking for somewhere else, because otherwise you're going to end up in burnout eventually. Because with all your decision making, all your communication, if you're always having to intentionally do it differently, that's really exhausting. I'm always a little bit nervous with this terminology of, who's a good fit, because I feel like a lot of unconscious bias can hide in that phrase of like, well, good fit means someone who's not like me, basically. If we don't really clearly define what is a fit and what are our values specifically. But, and that reminds me of something, Tamsin, you said earlier when asked about why this one. You said, I feel like organizational culture isn't something we talk about enough. And often we have to dig under the surface to understand, okay, the company's saying we have these challenges, but actually if we dig underneath that, there's something else there. I'd be curious to hear, how do you do that digging, that exploration underneath?
So, and I think because I'm in-house, I guess it's easier, right? Because you're there, you're within the culture itself, you exist within it, you feel things yourself, your teams feel things. But actually what I found has been the most kind of valuable is, or how I've kind of built it, I guess, is most valuable, is that we have this kind of vantage point in people, like in people services, in learning and development, that lots of the other parts of the organization don't have. So we're in those conversations from kind of training courses up to, actually HR is in conversations about, with the exec team, and you're there observing. So I think very much it has been about capitalizing on that and creating opportunities for that as well, kind of saying, oh, actually, it would be good for us to be in this space. These are the themes we're starting to see or hear. Does this resonate with people? And I think through that, almost being the fly on the wall a little bit. So really just being able to kind of capture all the information that you're seeing, the things you're not hearing, but are visible because actually you're there, kind of noticing these patterns or things that are kind of, oh, well, this keeps coming up, but actually we're saying it's this problem, but it doesn't sound like it is. So let's try something and see where that lands. And for me, that has been, I think, really fundamental in changing how we have been seen as a team in the organization, actually. So just being able to then say, well, for example, we're hearing that a focus at the moment is feedback, right? That people are being are struggling to give honest feedback because they don't want to upset people. So we're not going to go in and say, well, be really direct. We're going to say, right, what are some of the things that you're worrying about as part of this? Here are some tools to help you. So it's much more, I think, around bringing people with you, which I know is so cliche, but it's almost like we're listening, we're hearing these things, we're seeing this, let's try this. Is it having the impact that we think it will? And another thing that kind of, in particular has come up, so things around like prioritization and, how do we do that? But again, when you dig beneath the surface, it's not that people can't do that. It's, the emotional weight of letting things go when you work in a charity, right? Like there's this emotional weight or this kind of real sense of this is who we are, this is our identity that sits behind a lot of those things that I think unless you're there asking those questions, watching, observing, kind of putting those patterns together, you might just think, well, that's a prioritization problem. So yeah, that's how I see it. Rebecca?
I wanted to come back actually to something that you mentioned before, Tamsin, and actually something that you mentioned right at the beginning as well about learning and how do we adapt that to fit the culture. And I think it links in with some of the other discussion that we've had as well. I think in my experience, I've worked in a few different industries and I've definitely felt the difference in the culture in each of those workplaces, and then also the impact that has had on learning, and almost that, that subculture of learning, or the learning culture, whatever it is that you want to call it. On one hand, I've worked in businesses where everyone is, they're really raring to go every time there's something new. They really actively want to learn. Development is always at the top of the pad. And then I've also worked in businesses where, you even say the word learn, and it's, people are rolling their eyes, or they're checking their watch, or they're tapping on their laptop, and they're just not interested. So yeah, I'd like to, I guess, understand a little bit more about how you have gone about adapting that. Either of you, really, Tamsin or Kelly.
If I'm frank, I think it's still a challenge. It's it's still a challenge, and it's not. I think it's also dependent on what we talked about earlier, even team culture. Because actually some teams, or and maybe we can come to this around, because I think you mentioned it, Kelly, about kind of the leaders, right? Like, you essentially are following the leader. It's if they show the value of learning and development, and they're talking about why it's so important, they're having the right conversations with their people, and that can be manager or, leader of a function, or CEO, it kind of across the board. But if they're doing that, then you see the better engagement. Whereas actually where they're saying, well, I've never even had a conversation about where I want my career to go. No wonder you're not turning up, or you're sat there kind of checking emails while you're on something, because you're not going to see the value in how that's going to kind of benefit you as an individual. I think the main thing that we have tried to pivot is almost this is the thing that it's going to do for you, or allow you to do, but have really shifted actually away from lots of the kind of skills-based learning, so presentation skills or things like that, because I think you can find a lot of that online, right? People learn in different ways, and actually more about the softer skills of feedback skills, or psychological safety. How do you actually have a difficult conversation with somebody, where these are the things that people butt up against every day? It's not because they don't know, it might be they don't know how to structure some feedback, but really it's about how do they, how does that feel for them, and how can we help them make that feel a bit better or a bit easier? So yeah, did anything pop up for you, Kelly, in that?
Yeah, I mean, going off of what you said, I think giving people space to actually try things and practice them. Because like you said, information is everywhere now, right? You can look up how to give feedback anywhere. But actually creating, I think part of the problem, part of the disconnect is, if we're just going to take that as an example, it's so uncomfortable, right? For a lot of people, how to give feedback. And so creating space, both where people have the opportunity to build relational connections and create a safe space where people can actually practice those skills. Because I can sit through 50 presentations, but if I never actually have to do it and practice that skill and get over the initial discomfort, it's not really going to change what I do or how I do it. And so I've noticed, even in the evolution of my own trainings, there are much less me talking and a whole lot more participants actually doing, trying, practicing, giving feedback, coming back and debriefing, because that's where it's actually creating change for them. And that's more where the value is, than just, finding information somewhere. And I also think at the beginning, you were talking about leaders and motivation and setting the tone. And recently, I've been looking a lot into curiosity and the role of curiosity. And there's a great paper I found this morning. I haven't read it yet, but it's called Curiosity is Contagious. And so, what does that look like to become a more curious organization? And how can we model curiosity so that it's contagious and other people also get curious and want to learn?
I really like that curiosity, all about, asking more questions and not just taking things at face value. I definitely resonate with that. I'm a question asker. I like to ask lots and lots of questions. Something we touched on earlier, and apologies to sort of bring it back to this, because I feel like we're jumping around a little bit. But I've been thinking about it, whilst you were both talking there as well. But that adaptability of culture for each individual, or teams again. And Kelly, I think it was yourself that said about, sometimes it's about individuals maybe realizing that maybe this isn't the company for me. This isn't the right culture fit for me, and almost wondering whether there is an element of, do organizations need to be better maybe at helping candidates at recruitment processes, as an example, identify what that company culture actually looks like? Because I think you can read a set of values. We can all go on to Google, other web search is available, but we can go on there and we can have a look at an organization's values and their vision and their purpose. But does that actually tell us what it is like to work there? And I think some of that isn't always realized for a lot of people until they're in that role, and then they go, oh, this is it, this is what I'm in. So maybe how do we, I don't have an answer to that. I'm sure that neither of you have a concrete answer to that either, but just something that popped into my mind, like how do we, because I think we can play a part in that, particularly, for those of us that work in in-house roles, we tend to work quite closely with recruitment, talent acquisition teams, etc. In a lot of cases, how do we support with building some of that into that process? But yeah, just a thought.
Yeah, and I think, Tamsin, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, but just to quickly jump in, I think one thing that can be really helpful is to give people language to begin expressing what their company culture is. I feel like a lot of people, other than having the values written on the wall or on a sheet of paper, but what does that actually look like in day-to-day behavior? How does that actually turn up? So if we're going to I'll just come quickly back to the example of giving feedback. I was leading a workshop recently with a team, and a new expat had just joined. And so we were talking about, how do you give constructive criticism upwards? And they went into role play, they came back, and then we had a debrief, and every single local team member said, you go in private and you phrase it as a question. So in that local context, that was the way to give constructive criticism upwards. And for the expat, it was completely different, right? But it was really clear in that moment. And so I think, I find that that's a lot of what my work ends up doing, is helping people put terms and language, giving them a shared vocabulary to talk about what defines them and how they actually operate on a day-to-day basis. What do those values on the wall, how are they actually lived out? Because what looks like, it's not enough just to say, oh, we need to respect each other, because what feels respectful to you and what feels respectful to me might be really different things, right? And so defining more clearly what that actually means, I think, can be really helpful. That's not a comprehensive answer to your question, but I think that's a piece that I find really helpful for people and for teams and organizations. But yeah, Tamsin, do you have anything to add?
I actually just had a bunch more questions for you really on that. but just in terms of who even sets that, right? So, so often it's like, oh, but we have what our values look like in practice. But I think, to your point, I don't think necessarily you have it to the level of detail where people can act on it. But then also, if you did that, it would just be impossible, right? To be like, well, this small subset of team here, this is what it looks like for you. So yes, I'm fascinated about kind of, how do you, or is it the leaders kind of hash that out and then actually they take that back to their teams and their areas around what does that look like? But I'm conscious we probably could go on for hours with lots of questions around this. But.
So Andrew has put in the chat, what do we suggest the audience do next? Anyone has any thoughts?
Yeah, I think culture is one of those things that we just have to keep almost like bringing out into the open, right? I feel like what used to be a buzzword, and there was, whole teams working on it. And then when organizations kind of flipped to say, well, what value is this essentially bringing, there was this shift, I think, to how people were talking about culture, but perhaps it swung the other way where it no all about, we don't talk about it enough, or we don't surface what some of these things are enough. To your point, Kelly, what's the language that we can use to describe some of these things that make our team, our organization, the place that it is. So I think it's about how do we, as, L&D, as talent, as people teams, across different organizations or coming in to work with different organizations, just maybe we are the ones that have to be more curious, right? We are the ones that have to go in there trying to ask the right questions, trying to kind of, okay, you've said that, but I can hear something else. Let ask again in a different way and think, well, actually, maybe it's our place, our role at the moment to take that on and start to surface it so that actually we can build some of that momentum around, well, how is culture impacting some of these big organizational kind of challenges or opportunities, or, particularly in this landscape, right? Like, what is the culture that is meaning that AI can thrive in some and not in others? We need to be the ones that are going in with those curious questions, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. I think we need to talk about it more. We need to be more curious about it. Maybe that needs to be the tagline: curious about culture is what we need to go forward with. But yeah, I agree with everything you said, Tamsin. Thank you both so much. It's been lovely to speak with you both today.
Yeah, thank you. I've enjoyed learning from your insights and hearing your different experiences. It's given me a lot more to think about. So thank you for taking the time to have this conversation today.
Yeah, thank you both. I've loved it. I think, like we had said, we could have talked for much longer. There's probably emails afterwards about what about this, but just it's been a joy. So thank you both.
One of the things that comes through this conversation is just how easy it is to talk about organisational culture as though it's a single thing that can be created or changed. In reality, it shows up in all sorts of places: how people communicate, what gets rewarded, what gets ignored, how difference is handled, and what people learn is actually safe to say and do. A huge thank you to Kelly, Tamsin and Rebecca for their time and for such a wide-ranging conversation. You'll find their details along with the links and resources mentioned in the show notes. And if you enjoy the podcast, please do like and subscribe on your podcast player. It genuinely helps other people find us. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, and next time it's The Apprenticeships One. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.